1998, 27 months old was considered very early for a child to receive a diagnosis of autism. So, unlike many families we know, our son was eligible for early intervention services. As awareness of autism has grown in recent years, more children are receiving a diagnosis of autism in time to receive early intervention services, which can make a vital difference in their lives. Ivan is a twin. He and Bernard met the typical milestones of standing, walking and talking within days of each other. Both boys were saying things like mama and bye-bye, and by their first birthday. But several months later, we noticed Ivan wasn't saying new words like his brother was. And in fact, he wasn't saying much of anything. Also, he often acted as though he couldn't hear and never responded to his name. Given his history of ear infections, we were concerned about his hearing. He also preferred to be alone and seemed to lack a sense of danger that his brother possessed. I talked with our pediatrician about my concerns. He preferred to wait until the boys' 2-year checkup to see where they rated a developmental checklist. Our tennis's early intervention system coordinator set up hearing and speech evaluations immediately. Ivan's hearing was normal, but his language was of equivalent of an 8-month-old's. The speech pathologist then referred us to the development psychologist after we received the speech evaluation results. I told my husband, John, that I thought Ivan was autistic. We did some internet research at the website of Autism Society of America and concluded that Ivan's behavior did indeed match so symptoms. Several weeks later, after a psychologist had evaluated Ivan, we received the official diagnosis. Ivan had autism. Ivan thought it was what we had expected. It was still very difficult to hear. I now realize that we were very fortunate to receive Ivan's diagnosis as rapidly as we did. It took just 2 months from the time our pediatrician referred Ivan to TEIS until he received his diagnosis. Many families struggle for years and visit multiple doctors before the children receive an accurate diagnosis. The psychologist then outlined the most important interventions for Ivan. She listed an order of importance: speech therapy, both group and individual, and development preschool class and occupational therapy. Within 3 weeks, Ivan was in group speech therapy twice a week, individually therapy twice a week, in a development preschool 3 days a week, and occupational therapy once a week. Initially, I was extremely pleased by what I saw at Ivan's preschool and impressed by his group speech therapy, because I saw stark differences in 2 settings. The preschool was unhappy, colorful place that mixed typical children with children who had special needs. But Ivan was extremely distracted by all things in the room and seldom interacted with the other kids. A basic premise of this school was to let the child direct to his own activities as much as possible. For Ivan, that meant roaming the perimeter of the classroom for most of the day and swimming in the sand when they went outside. Meanwhile, the group speech sessions were held in the stark, bare room with a tile of floor and a table and chairs, and the children were made to practice and participate using hand-over-hand prompts and other psychological assistance when necessary. Although some of the kids would tantrum or melt down when demands were placed on them, I became convinced that Ivan was learning much more in that setting than in his preschool. Unfortunately, by the time I realized that Ivan needed a preschool, he was nearly 3, and it was time to transition to the school system. In searching for other options, I looked into a relatively new, at that time, method of teaching children with autism called applied behavioral analysis. But the one person I know in our area providing such a service had a waiting list for a year. Although I'm extremely grateful for the services we received through the TEIS, I regret the amount of time I had to spend driving Ivan to all his therapy and having to drag behavior alone. I'm glad that early intervention services now are much more likely to be delivered in a home and incorporate of the family. Our only in-home assistance came through the Tennessee Infant Parent Service, and which brought the teacher into our home for an hour per week to help us learn how to teach Ivan. I'm thankful that we had 10 months in the early intervention system before we had to transition to the local school system. Those 10 months allowed us to have independent evaluations and a significant amount of therapy without having to worry about how to pay for those services. Those 10 months also gave us time to learn about autism and how it affects our son. And those 10 months allowed us the opportunity to learn about our son's rights under the Individuals with Disabilities Education Act, IDEA, so that we were enabled to go into our first IEP meeting well prepared. Ivan, now 7, and has finished first grade, where he spent most of the day with his typical peers in general education classroom. He has an assistant with him throughout the day, both to help keep him safe and to keep him on task. The curriculum is modified for him, and some accommodations such as the picture exchange communication system are used. Although Ivan still has very low expensive language skill, his receptive language skills are quite good. And despite his lack of communication and social skills, he has lots of friends at school kids. Although Ivan still has very low expressive language skills, his receptive language skills are quite good. And despite his lack of communication and social skills, he has lots of friends at school, kids who are willing to help him, talk with him, and play with him. For us, that has been such a blessing. There are some things.
Welcome back. It was a little bit long report, but for moms, when it comes to children and some problems that are concerning their children, of course they care a lot about it, and that's why they mention all the details so that they can get the best help. I wish that her kid Gadwaling will be just fine. And Dr. Khaled, now I want to ask you about the characteristics of autism. As she mentioned that her kid was just fine as her twin, but later on, after the first year, they found that there was sort of development in one and the other wasn't. What are the characteristics of autism, or the symptoms that when parents observe on their children, they should immediately ask a psychologist or psychiatrist or a pediatrician?
Yeah, as we saw in the or we heard up in the case study, or the case that has been presented.
Yeah.
The main problem that kids with autism would face, or you notice with, is the social interaction, and also the verbal and non-verbal communication.
She mentioned that before the